A few days have slipped by and we're all worming our way through this patch, whether it be going up in LP or going down. Today, let's talk about who's doing the best on the patch as we construct our tier lists for each lane. Even if you don't play a specific role, it's still a good idea to know who's strong so that you know what to expect. And keep in mind, we aim these tier lists mostly for you guys. We go for platinum and below as our mark for where we place these champions. If I was to rate things as if everybody was a challenger level player, 1, it'd be boring, and 2, it wouldn't be useful for you at all. You know when you walk into the kitchen like a gremlin at 3 in the morning and you open the fridge and there's nothing in there that looks good to eat except for that one block of cheese sitting on the top shelf? That's what my fridge is like, except instead of a block of cheese, all I have is 3 million like and sub buttons. So make sure you click them because I'm handing them out like candy. And while you're at it, head over to our website, GameLeap.com, in order to learn more and find more guides that are even more in depth than what we can go into here on YouTube, where we highlight champions on our videos like this. Let's get down to the highlighting, starting with, of course, the mid lane. And the broken tier has an addition here, but yes guys, Annie isn't leaving anytime soon. Until Riot addresses the fact that Annie is simply overtuned, she's gonna stay up there. But right now, Pyke is doing so well and hasn't really shown any signs of dropping down at all. In fact, on this patch, he's actually doing even better, and if you take a moment to think about it, it makes a lot of sense. Pyke counters a lot of other meta champions because he's good against poke, he's good against all-in, and he's good against people who rely on things like lifesteal to live. When a Pyke all-ins you and ignites you, that's when you just kinda accept your fate unless you have flash or a mobility spell to dodge his ultimate. Just make sure you aren't making the horrible mistake of flashing early and then still getting Pyke'd. You have to react to it, otherwise you're never gonna guarantee that you'll escape alive. Dropping down into S tier, let's talk about Diana, as she's a champion who honestly is really close to being broken. Honestly, if Kassadin, Nocturne, and Galio weren't good right now, and Annie and Pyke being even stronger than her, I would 100% without a doubt rate her as being broken. These champions are some of the champions that can manage to keep Diana down in the early stages or counter her later. Diana is just super consistent, does a lot of damage, is extremely hard to kill, doesn't even really get countered that badly by anti-healing, and at all points in the game is always a really key member of the enemy team that you need to be looking out for in teamfights. With that sort of pressure, it shouldn't be surprising that Diana is good and borderline broken. As we move into A tier, this is where things that happened on the patch really start to come into play. Let's talk about Syndra, as she just got a nerf that might have seemed kinda small. One of Syndra's greatest strengths was her ability to match almost anybody in the lane, thanks to her low cooldown, relatively low mana cost Q, which could push the wave, poke at enemies, or initiate trades without having to worry about minion aggro since it is not a targeted ability. Having that increased Q mana cost hurts her in so many different ways. She can't push waves for as long, she can't harass people for as long, she needs to be more reserved with her spells, and so she doesn't want to throw things out and waste mana because it could be an extreme problem for her combos later. And when you bundle all these together and some other things on top of them, it becomes a big problem for how Syndra plays the laning phase. Honestly, I'm tempted to rate her lower right now in this moment, but that'd be a little bit of jumping the gun, as it's definitely certain that Syndra is going down in performance, but by how much? Well, we don't know yet because people aren't used to the changes yet. Keep an eye on your Syndra players, or yourself if you are a Syndra player, as you do still scale equally well. So once you hit that point in the game where your Q is maxed at level 9, nothing else changes. As long as you can make it to that point, things are going to get a lot better, which is why I still have hope for her and aren't pushing her any lower. Now we break out into the B tier, which is the dead average pretty much. And here you can see there's a new addition to the mid lane tier list, which is Kog'Maw, as Riot made a buff specifically targeting AP Kog'Maw to make him a little bit more playable. Now Kog'Maw mid is actually pretty good, and this buff makes him very good, if you're a good player that is. Kog'Maw mid is one of the hardest things to pilot in the game, as he is almost entirely skill shots and his early lane is extremely weak compared to other mages. You lose to just about everybody, but if you get items, you can become an unstoppable machine that can kill people from almost 3000 range. Just keep in mind that you lose lane to almost everybody unless you heavily outrange them or they simply can't deal damage to you for some reason. In C tier, let's talk about Karma, as there's been a recent build that's kind of been coming up with Karma that seems like it could be promising, but right now it's too early to tell. We've seen players in Korea take Spellbook on Karma mid and go for a pseudo-support high damage playstyle, where they rush Athenes and Ardent but then immediately go for Rabadons nearly every single game. The playstyle of this build is to stalemate your opponent and control the lane more than they can, so that you can provide more value to yourself and your team by moving out of the lane where necessary. The spellbook itself and the runes in the inspiration tree are meant to help you with that. However, if you aren't doing that properly, Karma mid is going to feel really underwhelming, which is why she's where she is. And lastly, in the D tier for mid lane, we started that cumulative timer for Akali last patch, and so now we're going on 2 patches where Akali is in D tier. Let's see how long she can make it there. She might be an acceptable pick in very high elo, or potentially even in a lane where she's a heavy counter pick. Other than that, you're gonna have a rough time. If you're dead set on learning a new champion, or just dead set on improving at League, definitely go check out our website GameLeap.com, where we have tons of guides all done by challenger level players. Whether you're looking to pick up a new champion, new skills in a specific lane, or just work on the fundamental and basic skills that make you a better player no matter what you're doing, we have something up there for you. Now you've got everything you need to know about the mid lane tier list, so let's move on up to the top lane, and right away, in the broken tier, let's talk about Quinn, alright? This champion is a cheater champion because she's ranged, and everybody knows that when you play a ranged champion in the top lane, you're cheating. And that's probably why Quinn is doing so well right now. You're basically cheating when you play her. She can abuse a lot of matchups, even one that she's technically supposed to lose. This is because Quinn as a champion makes it so that your opponent has to play perfectly if you are, otherwise you just win super hard. Quinn's ability to destroy people engaging on her by using her blind, and also do the same thing again by using her E properly, makes her really annoying for all of the other top tier picks in the top lane. And when I say annoying, I mean basically impossible to deal with without some outside help. And let's be real, top lane is an island and nobody wants to go there. That's why Quinns can snowball their lead and get to a point where they're so far out of control that they take over the game. S tier does have somebody who gets real close to being able to match Quinn though, other than Singed. Volibear has some really good mechanics built into his kit that can counter Quinn if the Quinn messes up even just a tiny bit. Volibear's Q resetting means that anytime Quinn CCs him with her E, he easily gets the cooldown back and can simply chase her down even with her Q blind. This makes it so that a Quinn player, or anybody playing any cheater champion in the top lane, needs to kite Volibear pretty much perfectly, even with his increased movement speed. Throw in his excellent sustain, ability to shield himself, and have decent poke in lane as well as good farming, and he's a very formidable champion for almost any other champion in the game. Let me put it this way, if you decided to pick up Volibear top right now, you would be doing just fine. Let's give a solid example of this in Darius in the A tier. You could probably already imagine why Darius would have trouble against the champions in the broken tier, but the S tier might be a little bit different. Volibear versus Darius specifically goes the way of Volibear because he ignores what Darius wants to do. Darius wants to get in really long extended trays and cheese people with his Ghost Flash and make it so that they cannot escape when he ramps up with his passive fully. The catch here is that after a certain point, Volibear begins to no longer care thanks to his incredibly powerful W. And early on, he has multiple ways to get away from the Darius by utilizing his E-slow and Q-stun and Q-movement speed. When Darius isn't ahead, he can feel really underwhelming and very difficult to play. That's why champions who like to control who they're fighting, and as you can see, all the other champions above him control who they're fighting, he has a tough time. B tier has somebody who absolutely needs to get highlighted here. Let's talk about Ornn, and specifically what happened to him on the patch. The nerfs to his passive and the way that his health totals and mana totals change based on what he builds in lane really made him take a hard hit. The thing is, it's not always going to affect him, because in lanes where he already wins, he's not going to have a problem. But the lanes where he loses, oh, those become way worse for you. You can no longer rely on the items that you buy giving you a ton of extra stats to survive the laning phase. That being said, he's still a solid pick, just not a solid pick all the time. C tier in the top lane starts to get a little bit spicy because a couple new champions have dropped down into here, and for right now, let's highlight Aatrox. Aatrox definitely isn't the easiest champion around. His build is pretty weird, at least in the early game, where you're mainly focusing on your CDR components, and honestly, his level 6 isn't really that great. What Aatrox does have though is that the moment, and I mean the absolute millisecond that you hit your Black Cleaver plus Death's Dance item spike, you become Thanos until other people and you are hitting 3 items and beyond. Aatrox is incredibly strong once you have those 2 items, and every item after that you do still spike again, but not nearly as hard. So you have a champion who ramps up kinda slow, hits really hard, and then falls off slower than other people, but still falls off for sure. If you do somehow manage to pull ahead on your opponent though, you will notice that you start to smash open the game, as Aatrox can feel like his 2 item power spike when you're ahead of the enemy. Lastly, in D tier, let's talk about Yasuo just one more time to make sure that everybody's on the same page. Yasuo got nerfs to his base health and a compensation to his shield passive in order to roughly make him as tanky as long as he's abusing the shield properly. But in top lane, where most things can't be windwalled, more people have CC that he can't block or dodge, and the lane is longer. If you are playing Yasuo in the top lane, you will notice compared to mid lane that it's way harder for you to survive all the crazy stuff that gets thrown at you in the early and mid game. Even then, sometimes when you do survive, you'll still struggle against people until much later in the game who naturally beat you because they're just stronger. Somebody like Jax or even a Fiora, if they're even in items with a Yasuo, usually end up winning. Top lane is nicely wrapped up in the island that it is, but now we have to venture deeper into the bushes of the jungle. Let's talk about the Bush Boys. Right away in the broken tier, I can tell you without hesitation that Volibear is the best jungler right now in general. The jungle as a whole always has certain champions who do well against others and struggle against some of the other part of the crew. That being said, the amount of people that Volibear struggles with is extremely small. He has tools that help him in just about every single way, whether it be clearing jungle camps or doing objectives or even tower diving. He has something to bring to the table, and that's very important. As a jungler, you are naturally playing around your lanes. And with the tools Volibear has, he is playing around lanes absolutely spectacularly right now without ever really having to sacrifice something for it. In the S tier, let's highlight Shyvana because she is somebody who has to sacrifice something. Shyvana in the early game is extremely hard to get a gank off because you have no mobility, kinda low damage, and absolutely no range. The whole point of Shyvana, specifically AP Shyvana, is to farm everything that you possibly can. Just eat all your jungle camps over and over again on cooldown. If your laners die, take their farm. If anything ever goes wrong anywhere, it doesn't matter. Your whole goal is to get money and experience, because once you hit level 6 and once you hit 1 to 2 items, you start to pop off anytime you have your R. Having your Dragon Form E opens you up to do so many more things because the burn and burst damage is so crazy. You can clean up fights that just happened. You can do way more objectives really quickly. You can farm faster. You have better everything. In the A tier, quite a few champions moved up here, as many of them either got buffed or because some other people got nerfed, they're feeling a bit better. Let's talk about Nocturne, as his buff was seemingly small, but realistically, it turned into a massive clearing and fighting buff for him. Right now, with his new buffs, Nocturne's clear is extremely healthy, and usually he wants to do a full clear, but no matter what he's doing, it's going to be faster and healthier than before. Because of that, he can show up to ganks and fight sooner, and those ganks and fights are better because the passive bug fix makes his damage more consistent, as before he wasn't properly getting the cooldown reduction on his passive when hitting champions all the time. So if you have faster clearing, healthier clearing, the ability to get to places faster because of that, and better fights no matter how you look at it, what'd you lose? And the answer is nothing. Nocturne got a strict buff, and that's why he's doing a lot better now and why he's moved up into A tier. For B tier, let's talk about Jarvan, as he is normally seen as one of the quintessential champions of League. It's somebody that everybody can recognize. He is like a stereotype almost. But for somebody who is so obviously trying to be the main character in a story, he definitely doesn't feel that way. Jarvan's in the B tier because he's not a good champion, but he's not a bad champion either. You can pick him into almost anything, but will he be a convincing pick every time? Absolutely not. Does he always have good ganks? Not really. Jarvan's main strength is the ability for him to flex between going full damage and full tank. When you're in a position where you're getting super fed and you have the right runes, you can absolutely take over a game and start one-shotting everybody. And if things happen to go the wrong way, you could always adapt to the situation. The hard part is figuring out which one is right, and even beyond that, when you do pick the build that you're going for, playing the playstyle differently. And since he's so diverse and doesn't do one thing necessarily super better than the other, he's suffering because he doesn't have something that he specializes in. For C tier, let's talk about Sylas, as things are in an interesting spot for him right now, but he's not doing too hot. Sylas recently got buffed really heavily because the jungle items got buffed in the sustain that they give you. You see, Sylas's main problem is that he's only really good at ganking and fighting. His first clear is okay, but everything after that is pretty slow, and unless he's ahead is gonna feel pretty awful. Because of that, asking ahead of time to guarantee that you get yourself ahead and not fall behind in golden experience compared to your opponent, well, it is a really hard thing to make come true over and over again consistently. He can still be a good pick though, especially if your team is lacking magic damage, as Sylas does scale insanely well. Lastly, as part of the jungle tier list, D tier, let's talk about Camille, as she was a champion who was extremely oppressive in the jungle a long time ago, and while she can still be played now, you probably don't ever see her, and you're probably not going to see her. This is because Camille focuses primarily on ganking lanes and spamming ganks over and over again, since she can't farm camps well. Considering that she farms slower than most, has item breakpoints that are extremely expensive, and that despite her ganks being good, she actually still loses 1v1 to many other junglers, she has a rough time. With Camille bringing up the rear, we've covered all of the Bush boys, so now let's move on to bot lane and talk about AD carries. And this one has a surprise right away. I honestly can't say why, but Jhin is doing even better than he was in the past. Now don't get me wrong, he hasn't jumped up a whole ton, but it's enough for him to surpass some of the other bot laners, especially considering that some of them have been nerfed. It seems that with the right blend of bot lane matchups, support metas, and meta in the other lanes, Jhin isn't having too much of a problem winning games right now. 100% this has to do with a less reliance on taking things like Baron and Dragons to end the game very, very early. Specifically for the Baron point, Jhin is definitely one of the worst Baron takers in the game, maybe even the worst hands down. As an AD carry, or somebody who's supposed to have DPS, usually Baron is one of your key jobs. But for Dragon, that changes, because Dragon doesn't have the same debuff that Baron has, reducing some of your allies' damage. So even when you are playing for Dragon Soul win conditions, Jhin is still a decent pick there. With some things covering up his weaknesses and other things removing them entirely, Jin's in a good spot to be taking over games. Moving down to S tier, let's talk about Twitch. Twitch is a weird AD carry for sure. He definitely plays, in some ways, closer to an assassin. Many times, you're trying to position for flanks and unique angles into fights that let you take advantage of your R. On top of that, if you happen to sneak up on somebody in a 1v1, assuming that you do it correctly and not against somebody who just straight up beats you, you probably just win. Being able to get picks like this consistently allows you to have really good objective control if you're killing people around when they spawn. This also gives you another way to snowball yourself in a game. Considering that Twitch benefits from a lot of the meta supports, he is in a good spot and it shouldn't be surprising. For A tier, let's talk about Ezreal since he just moved down here, and this is pretty much strictly because more people have become comfortable with his new build, but also because of the slight nerf to Death Stance. Since Ezreal can't quite mitigate as much damage as before, it certainly hurts him, but on top of that, the meta isn't in a great spot for him. It is extremely easy as Ezreal to completely lose control over a lane, and so when you can get punished so hard in the early game that it doesn't matter how well you scale, it becomes very hard to push him any higher on a tier list. He was an outlier last time because he was one of the few champions that people were building Death Stance on in the AD carry role. But now that many others have started to pick up the tech because it's just simply too strong, they actually stand a chance since the item field is evened up. That's why his performance this patch has definitely taken a hit compared to last one. In B tier, Varus should be highlighted as he just recently got a nerf, although not on this patch. His performance did go down a little bit from his nerf, but he's still a very solid pick that's very consistent and has the ability to win games very easily when ahead. His lane can be very oppressive, especially considering the meta supports help him out a lot, and with all that put together, he's an okay pick. When people start to get in their death stances though, you should watch out, because Varus starts to get way worse. In C tier, let's talk about Kalista, as this is a champion who has consistently had dropping win rates in the bottom lane over several patches. It seems like Riot isn't satisfied with where she is over and over again and keep trying to throw nerf after nerf, no matter how small, at her in order to adjust her, but it never seems to work out the right way. At this point, it's hard to recommend her anywhere, but if anything, you would want to play her in top. That being said, she requires a ton of practice to get down correctly, so don't expect to be smashing immediately if that's what you're trying to do. Finally, in D tier, nothing has actually changed here from last patch. Both Lucian and Kai'Sa are struggling. They're kinda two opposite sides of the same coin. Lucian is pretty strong in the early game and is very good at finding leads, but he requires you to play pretty risky, and because of that can often attract unwanted ganks and a lot of deaths. On the flip side, Kai'Sa is a champion who has a pretty bad early game and oftentimes loses trades, especially considering that many supports are good at mitigating damage. Neither of them are feeling too hot right now, but with that, we've wrapped up the AD carry tier list, and the only thing that's left to do is go over support, which actually has the least movement out of all the other roles here. For the broken tier in support, we have a newcomer joining Janna, as both Janna and Sona are doing pretty much fantastic across all elos right now, and that's very impressive. Not many supports can boast that. What becomes clear here is that these champions function in a similar way, having good poke in the early game with ways to mitigate or sustain through damage, and mobility that aid their allies. They also can function as some sort of engage depending on what the enemy team comp is and what their team is trying to do. They both excel in choke points and clustered fights where their abilities can hit everybody. Stepping down into S tier, let's talk about Soraka, as she is somebody who is similar and does also have a similar level of area control, although not as good. The problem with Soraka support is that while you can have really insane pressure in the early stages of the game in bot lane, as people begin to get items and recall and come back to lane, you kind of have less and less impact, and her playstyle often causes her to push the lane, which can be extremely risky. It's also really tough to recover on Soraka when you fall behind, because 800 gold is all that stands between you and becoming useless on the enemy team. Having less heals and then having that reduced even further just makes your impact almost nothing. In A tier, we could talk about somebody who's moved up, and that's Brand. As Brand is a very impressive support because of his insane damage and scaling. Many times as Brand support, you will notice that you actually do a ton of damage, probably more than almost anybody else on your team. This is due to the natural AoE of his abilities and the natural percentage max health damage that he has. Brand is one of those champions who can actually solo carry games and fights, but you have to play perfectly. That's why putting him in the bot lane, where things can get more spicy and also have more people, makes it a lot more consistent for him, where he might have set up from his allies or even his own AD carry. B tier is where things get kind of weird, because you have so many different types of champions that you wouldn't really think all of them could belong to the same tier. Let's highlight Thresh here, as he is a champion who is incredibly flexible. He has good damage, he has good heal, he has the ability to engage, and he can build supportive items that heal his allies. You might be familiar with this already though, as we spoke about this earlier when we covered a different champion. This means that Thresh doesn't really have a fantastic strength other than what he brings in the very early game. A Thresh without follow-up just dies. A Thresh who doesn't have teammates that collect lanterns doesn't save anybody. A Thresh who mistimes his E doesn't save his teammate from somebody engaging on top of them. These are a lot of the problems that you will run into if you play Thresh. If you can overcome them though, he is a fantastic champion, but his extreme difficulty and flexibility means that he's not doing so hot in general. For C tier, you guys already know who I'm gonna highlight here. Let's talk about Yuumi, okay? This champion got an insane change. Riot tacked on a 15% max mana cost to her E. To give you guys a quick recap of what that means, that 15% cost gates Yuumi and makes it so that she can only really get 7 E's out before she starts to run out of mana, no matter how much she builds. And that's assuming that you spend no mana on other abilities at any other time. This weakens Yuumi against poke, and it weakens Yuumi against teams that can repeat engage. Yuumi's strength right now is engaging a fight with her R and healing multiple people throughout an extended fight where she slows and CCs several people. The gutting of her mana cost makes it a lot harder for her to sustain against consistent damage, and adding new things to her weaknesses makes her obviously a lot weaker. Lastly, in D tier, Tahm Kench is a support who should really only ever be played when you're duo queue or if you're a professional player. But if you're a professional player, I don't know what you're doing here, because you don't need me to tell you a tier list, you already know what's going on. And that's the support tier list wrapped up, and all of our tier lists wrapped up for patch 10.13. To find guides on a lot of the champions that we've covered in this video today, and other important skills that you need in order to be good at League, make sure you go check out our website, GameLeap.com, where we have tons and tons of guides that are all done by challenger level players. If your goal is to improve, there's no easier choice to make, it's a no-brainer, guys. We're always releasing more and better content, so even if you somehow manage to watch every single thing we have up there, we always keep more coming for you. And if you made it this far, thanks for watching the whole video. Don't forget to let us know what you think about all the champion ratings in the comments, and anyways, as always, my name is Ace Windstorm, and I will see you all later.